guys. I'm going to read chapter 7 from Lion Witch in the Wardrobe. Oops, sorry, you don't need my post-it. Okay, I just want to quickly talk about what we have read so far. I know a lot of you took that quiz last week, and I was actually really surprised at some of the responses because the questions were really basic. So I need to make sure that you are following along, you're visualizing this in your head. Okay, because as I read this, I talk about some elements of fantasy, like I've done in the slideshow, but also just how your mind should be thinking when you get to certain points in these stories. Okay, before I start, let's just talk about it. There were 4 siblings. Okay, 2 boys, 2 girls. We have Peter, who's the oldest. We have Susan, who's next. Edmund, and then Lucy. Okay, they live in London, but London is actually being attacked by air raids. Okay, so like bombs dropping out of the sky. So their mother sent them to a family friend's house, this man, the professor, and he lives in this very old, huge house. It's a historic house. They actually have tours. People come around and do tours in this house. The kids don't really know the professor, but they're staying there because it's the safest place for them right now. So they go playing hide and seek, and they're going through all these doors. They find this wardrobe. Lucy goes in first, and she finds that this is actually a magical wardrobe. It takes her to another land called Narnia. Okay? Her siblings don't believe her. They think she's making it up. The professor says, well, why don't you just mind your own business? You know that Lucy's not crazy, and you know she's not a liar, so just worry about yourself and let Lucy worry about herself. Meanwhile, Edmund had also gotten into the wardrobe and into Narnia. He met this woman, the Queen of Narnia, she called herself. She gave him Turkish delights, those little jelly candies, and she told him when he comes back, she wants him to bring all of his siblings. They're back in the wardrobe now, okay? All 4 of them are there, and they happen to get in by chance, and they feel bad because they're like, oh my gosh, Lucy, I can't believe we didn't believe you. I'm so sorry. They go to see Mr. Tumnus the fawn. They realize that his cave has been destroyed. It looks like he was captured by the Queen of Narnia. Now remember, Edmund had met this Queen of Narnia, and he kind of was friendly with her. Do we know if the Queen of Narnia is the same as the White Witch? We're kind of getting to that point because Lucy says, oh, she calls herself the queen. She's not a real queen. And when we left off with chapter 6, Edmund was saying to Peter, well, how do you know that the queen's not actually the queen? How do we know that the fawn is the good and this queen is the bad? Maybe the queen is actually good and the fawn is bad. So he's trying to kind of get Peter to see that maybe Lucy's not right. You might be having a feeling in your head of how you think Peter's acting, how Edmund is acting. At this point, I, as a reader, kind of know that Edmund is a liar. I know that he's very spiteful. I know that he doesn't really have a good standing with his siblings, right? He tends to act very beastly. That was the word that they used. So just keep that in mind, okay? Edmund right now is a character that I wouldn't want to be friends with. He doesn't seem honest, and I don't know if he has everybody's best interest. So just think about that. We're going to get into chapter 7, okay? I will read the whole chapter, so this is kind of probably going to be a longer one, just because I did all that talking, because I like to talk. So here we are, chapter 7, A Day with Beavers. If you look at the screen, you'll see some vocabulary words. We have dodging, which means get out of the way, avoid. Okay, so if you're dodging something, you're kind of avoiding it. Token is something to show identity or friendship. Festoons are decorations. Gumboots are like rain boots. They're rubber boots. Oilskins is another word for raincoat. Mortar is material that you use to hold things together. So if you hear something like brick and mortar, the mortar is like the cement, okay, that would hold things together. And expressions got wind of is heard about. Oh, I got wind of, I heard about this. And merely a trifle is nothing very special, just something little. Okay? Um, so that's where we are. I'll make myself a little bit bigger if you like to look at me while I'm reading. Okay, I don't like to look at myself much, but here we are. Chapter 7 is titled A Day with the Beavers. And remember, they were following a robin. Okay. While the two boys were whispering behind, both the girls suddenly cried, "Oh!" and stopped. "The robin!" cried Lucy. "The robin! It's flown away!" And so it had, right out of sight. "And now what are we to do?" said Edmund, giving Peter a look, which was much as to say, "What did I tell you?" So he was like, "Now what do we do?" "Shh, look," said Susan. "What?" said Peter. "There's something moving among the trees over to the left." They all stared as hard as they could, and no one felt very comfortable. "There it goes," said Susan presently. "I saw it that time too," said Peter. "It's still there. It's just gone behind that big tree." "What is it?" asked Lucy, trying very hard not to sound nervous. Think about how you would be feeling here, right? You followed this bird into this land that you don't know anything about. You just happen to trust the bird, and now you see something moving. I would be scared too. "Whatever it is," said Peter, "it's dodging us. It's avoiding us. It's something that doesn't want to be seen." "Let's go home," said Susan. And then, though nobody said it out loud, but everyone suddenly realized the same fact that Edmund had whispered to Peter at the end of the last chapter. They were lost. "What's it like?" said Lucy. It's a kind of animal," said Susan. "And then look, quick, there it is." They all saw it this time, a whiskered, furry face which had looked out at them from behind a tree. But this time it didn't immediately draw back. Instead, the animal put its paw against its mouth, just as humans put their finger on their lips when they're signaling you to be quiet. That's what the animal did. It looked at them and did shh. Then it disappeared again. The children all stood holding their breath. A moment later, the stranger came out from behind the tree, glanced around as if it were afraid someone was watching, said "Hush!" made signs to them to join it in the thicker bit of wood where it was standing, and then it once more disappeared. "I know what it is," said Peter. "It's a beaver. I saw the tail." "It wants us to go to it," said Susan, "and it's warning us not to make noise." "I know," said Peter. "The question is, are we to go or not? What do you think, Lou?" "I think it's a nice beaver," said Lucy. "Yes, but how do we know?" said Edmund. "Shan't we have to risk it?" said Susan. "I mean, it's no good just standing here, and I feel I want some dinner." At this moment, the beaver again popped its head out from behind the tree and beckoned earnestly to come. So he's kind of telling them, "Come, come, come." "Come on," said Peter. "Let's give it a try. All keep close together. We ought to be a match for one beaver if it turns out to be an enemy." So he's saying, "There's 4 of us against a little beaver. If he's bad, we can take care of him." So the children all got close together and walked up to the tree, and in behind it, there, sure enough, they found the beaver. But it still drew back, saying to them in a hoarse, throaty whisper, "Further in, come further in, right in here. We're not safe in the open." Only when it had led them into a dark spot where 4 trees grew so close together that their boughs met, and the brown earth and pine needles could be seen underfoot, because no snow had been able to fall there, did it begin to talk. So it pulled them into this tiny little kind of like a secret hidden spot between 4 trees that were growing so close together that there was no snow there. It was a bare spot. You could see some pine needles, but it was almost just like a little place to be able to sneak. "Are you the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve?" it said. "We're some of them," said Peter. "Shh," said the beaver. "Not so loud, please. We're not safe here." "Why, who are you afraid of?" asked Peter. "There's no one here but ourselves." "There are the trees," said the beaver. "They're always listening. Most of them are on our side, but there are trees that would betray us to her. You know who I mean." And it nodded its head several times. We know this is a fantasy book, number 1. because an animal is talking, right? So if you didn't believe it was fantasy when we met the fawn and when she went into a wardrobe and came out into another land, talking animals are a huge part of fantasy stories. If it comes to talking about sides, said Edmund, how do we know you're a friend? So here's everybody else, right? They're willing to be trustworthy, and Edmund, he's just so rude, and he, he's just not kind, and he seems to be going against what everybody else is thinking. Not meaning to be rude, Mr. Beaver, added Peter, but you see, we're just strangers. Quite right, said the beaver. Here's my token. With these words, it held up a little white object. They all looked at it surprised, till suddenly Lucy said, Oh, of course! This is my handkerchief, the one I gave to poor Mr. Tumnus. That's right, said the beaver. Poor fellow, he got wind of the arrest before it actually happened and handed this over to me. He said that if anything happened to him, I must meet you here and take you on to... Here the beaver's voice sank into silence, and it gave one or two very mysterious nods. Then, signaling to the children to stand as close as they possibly could, so their faces were actually tickled by its whispers, it added in a low whisper, They say Aslan is on the move, perhaps has already landed. And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do. But the moment the beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it has sometimes happened to you in a dream that someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if it had some enormous meaning. Either a terrifying one, which turns out the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life and are always wishing you could get into that dream again. It was like that now. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump inside, almost like gives you chills, right? It's like something really good, not scary chills, but just it makes you feel good when you hear this word, okay? Edmund felt a sensation of horror. So listen. The other three kids, Peter, Susan, and Lucy, when the name Aslan was spoken, they felt like this must be just such a wonderful thing. And Edmund felt horror. He felt terrified at this name. Who is this Aslan person? Okay. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and you realize that it's the beginning of a break. Like the beginning of spring break or the beginning of Christmas break, and you just feel, this is wonderful. And what about Mr. Tumnus? Said Lucy. Well, where is he? Shh, said the beaver, not here. I must bring you where we can have a real talk and also dinner. No one except Edmund felt any difficulty about trusting the beaver now, and everyone, including Edmund, was very glad to hear the word dinner. They, therefore, all hurried along behind their new friend, who led them at a surprisingly quick pace, and always in the thickest part of the forest, for over an hour. Everyone was feeling very tired and very hungry when suddenly the trees began to get thinner in front of them and the ground to fall steeply downhill. A minute later they came out under the open sky. The sun was still shining, and they found themselves looking down on a fine sight. They were standing on the edge of a steep, narrow valley at the bottom of which ran, at least it would have if it had been running, a fairly large river. So remember that everything was frozen. Well, it's winter and never Christmas, okay? The snow's falling, the river's frozen. Just below them, a dam had been built across this river, and when they saw it, everyone suddenly remembered that, of course, beavers are always making dams, and they felt quite sure that Mr. Beaver had made this one. They also noticed that he had now a sort of modest expression on his face, the sort of look people have when you're visiting a garden that they've made or reading a story that they've written. So it was only common politeness when Susan said, "What a lovely dam!" And Mr. Beaver didn't say hush. He said, merely a trifle, right? Nothing very special, but he was proud of it. It isn't really finished. Above the dam, there was what ought to have been a deep pool, but was now, of course, a level floor of dark green ice, and below it, much lower, was more ice, but instead of being smooth, this was all frozen into the foamy and wavy shapes which the water had been rushing. So the water was going along at some point and then it just froze. Okay, so it's almost like there's um, mountains of ice in this, what would be a flowing river. The top of the dam was wide enough to walk on, though not for humans, a very nice place to walk because it was covered with ice, and though the frozen pool was level with it, there was a nasty drop to the lower river on the other. Along this route, Mr. Beaver led them in single file right out to the middle, where they could look a long way up the river and a long way down it. And when they had reached the middle, they were at the door of the house. "Here we are, Mrs. Beaver," said Mr. Beaver. "I found them. Here are the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve." And they all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed as she went in was a burring sound, and the first thing she saw was a kind-looking old she-beaver sitting in the corner with a thread in her mouth, working busily at her sewing machine. A beaver has a sewing machine? And it was from that the sound came. She stopped her work and got up as soon as the children came in. Here's a little picture of the children all walking into the little beaver's his little hut he made, okay? So we've come at last," she said, holding out both her wrinkled paws. "At last! To think I ever should live to see this day. The potatoes are boiling and the kettle singing, and I dare say, Mr. Beaver, you'll get us some fish?" "That I will," said Mr. Beaver, and he went out of the house. Peter went with him, and across the ice of the deep pool where he had a little hole in the ice which kept open every day with his hatchet. They took a pail with them. Mr. Beaver sat down quietly at the edge of the hole, and he looked hard into it, then suddenly shot in his paw, and before you could say Jack Robinson, he had whisked out a beautiful trout. Then he did it all over again, until they had a fine catch of fish. Here's Mrs. Beaver at her sewing machine. I'm just going to plug my computer in really quickly while I finish this chapter. Okay. Meanwhile, the girls were helping Mrs. Beaver to fill the kettle and lay the table and cut the bread and put the plates in the oven to heat and draw a huge jug of root beer for Mr. Beaver from a barrel which stood in one corner of the house. And they put the frying pan on to get the drippings hot. Lucy thought the Beavers had a very snug little home, though it was not at all like Mr. Tumnus's cave. There were no books or pictures, and instead of beds, there were bunks, like on a board ship built into the wall. And there were hams and strings of onions hanging from the roof, and against the wall were gum boots, rain boots, and oilskins, raincoats, and hatchets and pairs of shears and spades and trowels, and things for carrying mortar in, and fishing rods and fishing nets and sacks. And the cloth on the table, though very clean, was very rough. Just as the frying pan was nicely hissing, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish, which Mr. Beaver had already opened with his knife and cleaned out in the open air. You can think how good the new caught fish smelled while they were frying. I don't like fish, so that doesn't sound great to me. And how hungry the children longed for them to be done, and how very much hungrier still they had become before Mr. Beaver said, "Now we're nearly ready." Susan drained the potatoes and then put them all back into the empty pot to dry on the side of the range. That's the oven. While Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver to dish up the trout, so that in a very few minutes everyone was drawing up their stools. It was all three-legged stools in the Beaver's house, except for Mrs. Beaver's own special rocking chair, and preparing to enjoy themselves. There was a jug of creamy milk for the children. Mr. Beaver stuck to his root beer, and a great big lump of deep yellow butter in the middle of the table, from which everyone took as much as he wanted to go with his potatoes. And all the children thought, and I agree with them, that there's nothing to beat good freshwater fish if you eat it when it has been alive half an hour ago, and has come out of the pan half a minute ago. And when they had finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought unexpectedly out of the oven a great and glorious sticky marmalade roll. It's like a jam roll, steaming hot, and at the same time moved the kettle onto the fire so that when they had finished the marmalade roll, the tea was made and ready to be poured out. And when each person had got his or her cup of tea, each person shoved back his or her stool so as to be able to lean against the wall and give a long sigh of contentment. So after you eat a big meal, think about Thanksgiving, you're like, ah, right? It was good. "And now," said Mr. Beaver, pushing away his empty mug and pulling in his cup of tea toward him, "if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lit and going nicely. Why, now we can get to business. It's snowing again," he added, looking out the window. "That's all the better, because it means we shan't have any visitors, and if anyone should have been trying to follow you, why, he won't find any tracks." Here's a nice picture of the kids and the beavers all sitting around. Okay, so look closely. It's a nice little hut there. You've got Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the four children all eating. Okay, see the ham hanging from the top, the stove in the background, the door, there's the raincoat. All right. And that's the end of chapter 7. What do you think? Are the beavers good? Are they trustworthy? Think about it. All right. I'll see you soon.